Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing great. Well, Happy New Year. It's
Happy
2025.
New Year. It's been a while, it seems. Yeah.
Yeah, it has. And I'm excited because I can see the spring gardening season from here.
It's I'm a baseball fan, so I see the countdown every day.
Sure.
That's a hard date. Gardening, maybe a little bit more wiggle room, maybe a little bit of a gray area, but you can see it. And once you get to January, everything just kind of seems to be, it's still cold, it's still snowing, but we're in January. We're almost a third of the way through January now. By the time people listen to this, we'll be almost halfway through January.
But what's nice, John, is, I just don't sit during the winter twiddling my thumbs and, wishing for something that I could plant and grow. Houseplants. I love houseplants.
It's a great time to be active with your houseplants.
It is.
And really not only to be active, but just like to take it in, see what you can do, see what you've got, take in what you do have, take assessment
in a
of the
window
situation.
full of houseplants in January, that is some good gardening too. And so that kind of helps me bridge the gap.
And it's a way that we can keep our hands dirty. We can get our hands in the dirt. We can get our hands active.
I've never been a gardener that could wear gloves. I've been given gloves. Well, except pruning roses. I do wear very nice, heavy gloves. But, I've never been one to kind of wear gloves. If I've tried, usually they come off in a few minutes and are just kind of laying there. And so I kind of enjoy getting my hands dirty, the feel of dirt. And of course, today we're going to talk about repotting houseplants. And so I like to repot them in winter because that gives me a chance to get my hands dirty. Now, we may have talked before about, things to do in the fall. Right. And one of the things to do in the fall is to repot houseplants because it's easier outside.
Yep.
Because, you can keep the dirt and the mess. But, repotting houseplants in the winter here gives me that feel of the dirt.
Yep.
and so I kind of enjoy it. I enjoy it. My wife, Mary, is very patient with me. She doesn't mind. I'll sweep up after myself.
Right. That's very important.
So, it does give us that feel of gardening indoors. And man, are houseplants ever popular?
Yeah, definitely.
Really, probably starting with the pandemic. Well, houseplants have always been popular, right, but they do kind of come and trend a little bit.
Peaks.
Yeah. And when more of us were staying at home during the pandemic, many people rediscovered houseplants. And so, popular trend. And of course, repotting is part of the growing of houseplants. So it'll be fun to talk about that today.
Well, before we jump into that, we talked about New Year's. Let's quick go over, any New Year's resolutions?
Yes, I've got an ongoing New Year's resolution, and one of these days I actually have to do it. And that is to keep better track of the identity of my plants outdoors, the trees, shrubs, perennials. And they all come with a tag when you buy a new plant. And I've learned not just to stick that tag right beside the plant because, it might come loose and you lose that identity. Or after a year or so, they get brittle in the sun, then they snap and you can't read what's on it. And so I take that tag out of the pot when I plant it and I save them. But by save, I mean stick them in a tote, a little tub, and there they sit. And then I usually do put another label on the plant so I don't lose its identity. But I need to organize that bin full of plant tags. So my goal, maybe it's a 3-ring binder with clear pages in which I can insert those tags, maybe with a description as to where that tree or shrub or perennial is. So I need to do a better job of cataloging the plants that I have.
Do you have a map or of different areas? Because you have a very big lot.
I don't. But you see that's part of keeping the identity. That would be part of that resolution, is to map and keep a better idea, not only for my own, but if ever a person comes to a time where maybe you would sell that property. Hopefully for me, it's not going to be many, many years, but the new owners of that property, if they had a map, that's great information. So that's mine. How about you? Any New Year's resolutions for gardening?
Well, that's kind of always on there. There's a couple of projects that have been lingering for a while that I need to do. I want to get up some patio lights so that we can hang out in the backyard a little bit more, especially in the fall. It'd be really nice to have these kind of incentives to hang out back there. There's some different things I want to do with borders.
I like that term, lingering projects. I think we all have one or two of those lingering gardening projects.
Yeah, and I've got to redo I put in when we had the streets were dug up this year, so they dug up the boulevard, and they didn't put a sidewalk, a walkway between the sidewalk and the street. So I had to lay my own, but I did it so late I didn't get the what do they call the special kind of sand in there to keep it locked in?
Sure, they kind of lock the pavers together.
The pavers together. So I'm probably gonna have to dig the paver project up, redo that again, and put the sand in there. And but yeah, a lot of projects that I'm already thinking of. But yeah, that idea of being organized is always there. It's always something that I say I'm going to do, because this time in a couple of weeks here we'll be talking about planning your outdoor garden, and I have talked about it for years. I want to develop a map and to have areas and to note on where things are, so that this time of the year when I'm planning a garden, I can say, well, we've got this here, we've got this here, so we won't have space for that, but maybe we want something else there. Maybe we want a little height back behind that, or maybe we want something a little lower in front.
Yeah, see, a map like that would help in planning the future things that a person wants to incorporate too.
Yeah.
And in talking about labels too, one of the neat things in houseplant trends is, have you noticed that plants have names now? I mean, not like Jane and Theodore, not names like that. But there are more and more houseplants that are named cultivars now.
Okay.
They've selected and improved many of the houseplants. So when you go to the houseplant stores, the local garden centers and houseplant shops, you'll oftentimes find that tag in there giving that name. So when I talk about my own a New Year's resolution of keeping better track of and organizing names, I'm thinking the same thing even with our houseplants. I guess on an indoor pot, you could probably keep that tag with the plant and it's not going to go too far.
Right.
But, it's kind of neat too that these plants have cultivar names, which indicates improvements in most cases or something different. The devil's ivy, the pothos. Now there's some really nice, new, different types of those. And so it's good times for houseplants.
Well, so let's talk about houseplants. Let's talk about repotting the houseplants. Just kind of like, how do you know if you've got a plant that needs to be repotted?
And of course that's interesting. Yeah, how do you know? How long can a plant stay in its pot before you need to do something? Well, there are a couple of ways that we can tell. I've always thought that houseplants would make it easier for us to care for them if they could talk. I'm thirsty.
Yeah.
I'm hungry. Give me some fertilizer. It's too dark in here. Give me some more light. Or this pot's too tight. Move me up into a bigger pot. That would be really nice. Well, anyway, so there are some actual clues that the plants tell us if they need repotting. Even if they don't do it verbally, there are still some things. For me, one of the easiest ways to tell is to lift the plant out of its pot. Sometimes you can turn it on its side, the pot on its side a little bit, if the plant isn't too huge. Turn it on its side a little bit, tap on the bottom, and sometimes it will just slip out of the pot. Or sometimes with a large butcher-type knife, run that on the inside of the pot, the inside perimeter of the pot. That will loosen the soil. Then you can kind of lift it out of its pot. And so you examine the root ball. If once you've slipped it out of its pot, if the outside of that root ball is totally intertwined solidly with roots, it's probably time to repot and bump it up into a little larger pot. And also, if even without doing that, if there are roots growing out the bottom drain hole, that's a good indicator. A good indication that, it's looking for some new soil. And also, if you look at the top of the soil, when the plant is in its pot. If it looks hard packed, and no longer kind of nice, light and fluffy, but hard packed, that's a good indication that it probably needs some fresh soil. Or if the top of the soil potting mix is kind of a white, crusty, as water evaporates, it leaves salts and things behind it. So that's a good indication too that maybe it needs some fresh soil. So those are all clues. And so oftentimes there's a question too that comes up, is there a rule of thumb, can a plant stay? Is it 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? Is there a rule of thumb as to how many years a plant can stay in its pot? And there's not really a rule of thumb. I've kind of found that most plants every 1 to 2 years, maybe. Now, there are some kind of slow growing plants. Jade plant is an example. Maybe Christmas cactus, they can stay in the same pot for quite a few years. There are gardeners, houseplant gardeners that have kept plants in pots for decades. Maybe that's not the preferred, but I'm thinking of a great big heirloom Christmas cactus. They're not easy to repot just because they're physically kind of big, they're draping over. And how do you get it out of that pot into new pot? So some of those can probably stay a decade or so. And jade plant, jade tree, they're also kind of a little cumbersome. You have to be kind of careful. There are people who I think we know Ross Collins together. His mom wrote the garden column for the Forum newspaper.
For decades,
my predecessor for, I think, 50 years. Well, I believe he has a jade plant that's been in the same pot for decades, and it's doing well. But for most plants, probably a year or two in the same pot, and then you're ready. Also, if you buy a new little plant and slip it out of its pot, if it's very root bound, that's time also to bump it up into a slightly larger pot as well.
I suppose, with especially like newer plants, younger plants, you probably want to really keep an eye on that. If they are fast growing, you'll be able to tell if you can gauge it from when you brought it home, how much it's grown, then definitely, it will be time to move it on.
Yep, exactly. Because sometimes the new plants that we buy are have kind of reached the point where they need a new pot and a slightly larger. And another good indication of a plant needing repotting is if it seems to be drying out more frequently than it used to, meaning the roots have really filled that pot. And so if you find, for example, like a peace lily, they wilt very quickly if the soil becomes too dry. So if they have filled the pot with roots and the roots are having a little harder time accessing water and it's wilting quite often, then maybe it's time to repot into a slightly larger pot also.
All right, great. Let's take a quick little break and we come back more about repotting your plants, repotting your houseplants.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, we're back and we're talking about repotting houseplants. Let's talk about the materials. What do you need on hand when you're going to be repotting a plant? What are the things that you should be putting in that new pot besides the plant?
Well, I mentioned one thing that my wife Mary is so patient with me because this can be a messy operation indoors. So I like to lay down plastic or a newspaper on the table, something to catch all the potting mix, the excess and stuff. And so beyond that, we really just need potting mix and a pot. And I like to have a knife on hand or pruning shears too, and we'll get to why in a little bit later. But anyway, the potting mix. Now, notice that I didn't say potting soil. Now,
why is that?
Yeah, most of the potting mixes don't really have soil. Now, soil being kind of referring to, dirt, field type soil, garden soil. Most potting mixes do not have any of that. And the reason for that is most actual soil would carry some weed seed, that would need to be sterilized and killed. Also, there are probably some pathogens, disease organisms, rotting type organisms. So the potting mixes really have no soil in them, actual dirt type soil. And for example, when you're shopping for potting mixes for a houseplant, there is garden soil that is sold, but that's meant to be added to your garden outside, actual soil type things. And so that's why we see the potting mix. Sometimes a person will slip and kind of refer to it as houseplant soil.
Okay.
But really we're talking about mixes that have no actual soil. And oftentimes when you read things about houseplants, it'll refer to use a high quality mix. Well, what's a high quality mix? Are there some low quality mixes? Well, there are. A few years ago, writing for the garden column, I actually went around and bought every different type of potting mix that I could find. Okay, and some are very cheap and inexpensive. Some are more expensive. And right away, I could tell a difference in the weight of the bags. The cheap, inexpensive potting mixes were heavy in the bag.
Okay.
The more expensive type were light in the bag. And when I opened them up, added some water, kind of see what is the makeup of these different potting mixes. The cheap ones that were also heavy in the bag, when I'd water them and kind of squeeze a handful together, they were just sticky and gooey.
Okay.
And they had lower quality ingredients that would kind of cake together when wet. And the higher quality mixes that were also lighter in the bag, you could lift the bags easier. When you watered them and squished a handful together, it would also crumble apart better. And being better aerated, of course, is what roots need. Roots don't want to be in a clammy, kind of clay-like mix. And so right away, I could tell the difference in the weight and the price. And so because a houseplant is going to be in that pot for a while, in that mix, now isn't the time to scrimp and go cheap on it. Yeah. So definitely. So probably the most recognizable brand of high-quality potting mix is the Miracle-Gro potting mix in the green and yellow bag. There's also a moisture control mix by Miracle-Gro. That's great also. The Schultz-type brand has a nice blend of potting mix. That's probably the most nationally recognized. But also the locally owned garden centers, check with them. They will oftentimes have a brand that they use in their own greenhouses, and those are high quality. I mean, they're not going to use poor mixes for their own potted plants. So check with the locally owned garden centers and see which blend they recommend.
Are all potting mixes the good quality ones? Are all good quality potting mixes good for all plants, or do you want different kinds of mixes for different plants?
Yes. The majority of houseplants, green houseplants, are tropical in nature, from jungles. And they like a very organic type, kind of a jungly type, where you've got vegetation decomposing into nice humusy stuff. So for most of the tropical type houseplants, they like high organic matter. So you'll find those mixes have a lot of peat moss, coconut coir is kind of a new replacement for peat moss, a great organic kind of fibrous type material. And so those type of plants like those high organic potting mixes. And then also in those mixes, the high quality ones, you'll find aggregates such as the little shiny golden vermiculite or the white beads called perlite. So they drain well. But if a person is doing cactus and succulent, they need something very, very well drained, kind of more that would imitate a desert type soil. And so those, a person would find the high quality type cactus or succulent mix will be very, very well drained and porous. So yes, the nice thing about visiting your local garden center, they will have mixes tailored. They'll have the all-purpose mix. tropical type plants, cactus and succulent mix. There are mixes for African violets.
Oh, okay.
The orchid mixes. There are also orchid mixes that are very high in bark chunks because orchids, where they're native, most of them grow like on decaying trees. Yep. So they'll be high in bark chunks. So yeah, you can kind of tailor the potting mix to the particular plant that you're growing.
I like that idea of tailoring the potting mix. Could somebody make their own potting mix?
Well,
if they
yes.
Yeah. Could they?
Before the dawn of the age of the ready mixed potting mix, we had to make your own. My mom had to make her own, because Miracle Grow mix or other mixes weren't really available. So the long-time standard thing was a 3-part mix. 1 part organic matter, like peat moss or compost, old gardening books, you see well-rotted manure. Well, most of us don't have ready access to well-rotted manure, so that kind of fell by the wayside. But it was 1 part organic material, peat moss, well-rotted manure. 1 part of garden soil, actually soil out of your garden or flower bed, and then 1 part of an aggregate, such as sand, perlite, vermiculite, to kind of break things up. Now, I mentioned garden soil, actual soil. Well, there's a problem with that. Like I mentioned, the weed seeds and the pathogens, disease-causing organisms. So most of the recommendations also said to sterilize that soil component before you mix it in with the other parts. And of course, so then there were lots of recipes as to how long in the oven did you have to bake soil. Have you ever smelled baking soil? It's not pleasant.
No.
I remember that as a kid. When microwaves came along, then there were even recipes for how long to microwave your soil before you can add it to the mix. But, I like not having to mix those things. I like being able to buy these ready mixed products. And so it's a good time for houseplants.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should. That's the case here.
You got it, John.
Let's talk about containers and pots. Are they all the same?
Oh, and here's
what do you look for?
Yeah, here's the big debate. Do you go the traditional clay pot, the unglazed terracotta clay pot, or do you do a plastic or a ceramic? Plants will grow in almost anything. The key component is that it has a drainage hole so that excess water will drain freely. And so I always look for that. But now there are some advantages to the traditional unglazed terracotta clay pot. Well, plants look nice in them for one thing, but also they breathe through the sides. So air and moisture can be exchanged through the sides, and roots do need air, so that does help with root growth. And if you tend to overwater plants, if you keep them continually too moist, clay pots will be more forgiving because some of that excess moisture can evaporate out through the sides also of that. So clay pots tend to be a little more forgiving, but not all plants want to dry out that much in between. For example, ferns. Ferns like to be kept a little more moist. And so for ferns, maybe plastic pots or glazed clay type pot or ceramic type pots might be better. So really, as long as you're minding the watering and not overwatering something, really any container with a drain hole can work really well. For cactus and succulent, they kind of lend themselves to different types of shallow containers, dish type gardens. So you can really use almost anything. For example, African violets. African violets are a fun plant. They're probably the most prolific flowering houseplant. Lots of us nickname them grandmother's plants because grandmothers would oftentimes give them the care and the nurturing that African violets require. And I mean, when I say require, it sounds like it's a lot of work, but it's not. They reward you with the care that you give them. African violets. So it's fun to become an African violet grower. We've got a couple of them, and now African violets, oddly enough, don't like clay pots as well as plastic pots because where the stems of the leaf rest on the clay pot rim, they will oftentimes rot at that.
Really?
Because I suppose that clay pot maybe stays a little bit moist on the rim. Clay pots will sometimes kind of absorb salts out of the water, and so sometimes you'll see that they will kind of rot at that point, the African violet leaf stem.
Huh.
So that's why sometimes you'll see African violet growers put a aluminum foil over that rim or wax over that rim, or just grow them in a plastic pot. So plastic pots have almost become a little more traditional for African violet growers than the clay pots. But really, any container, I've seen houseplants growing in old shoes, okay. As long as it drains properly. Oh, and that also brings up the good point of having a nice drainage dish underneath. I like the plastic saucers that you can buy at garden centers. They're kind of just unobtrusive, somewhat invisible, yet they'll catch that overflow. If it's a container that has an attached drainage dish, that's nice, but sometimes you have to be careful. Some of those are very shallow, and if you get too much water flowing through, it can even overflow those. So I just personally prefer kind of the detached plastic type clear drainage dish saucer.
So when you're repotting a plant, how much of a bigger pot do you want to go to?
Oh, now that's a great point. A person might think, okay, I've bought a new little houseplant and it looks like it needs repotting. Why don't I just put it in a big pot, because then I won't have to repot it as often.
Right.
But, a small plant can wallow in too much soil. And so, and then when it just wallows in too much soil, they can tend to go downhill. Plants are interesting in that they seem to like to fill a pot with their roots, and it gives them kind of a comfort zone. And then, what we need to do is gradually increase the pot size. So when we determine that a plant needs repotting, we only increase about 1 inch or 2 inch in pot diameter, so that the root ball will have maybe about 1 inch around. For example, if it's right now in a 4-inch pot, maybe boost it up to a 6-inch pot, so that the roots will have 1 inch kind of all around, if you follow me.
Yeah.
And so gradually increasing the pot size, rather than going from a small pot into too big of a pot.
And I suppose that's something that if you're going to be checking it every 2 years, then you'll be able to catch it and see that, yes, it does need to go into another 2 inches bigger. So that's a good way to remember it too. Every 2 years, maybe every 2 inches.
It's a great rule of thumb. Super.
What about when you repot a plant, does it always need to go into a bigger pot?
No. Because, there's kind of a limit, especially with a larger plant that you've had for quite a few years. We don't want to keep increasing the pot size, or pretty soon there'll be something that's just totally unmanageable. So, what happens if you determine that a plant needs repotting because it's all root bound? And of course, that's the term root bound or pot bound. If the plant has filled its roots with If it's filled its pot with roots, so there's no more room, that plant is called root bound or pot bound. And so, what happens if you've already got that plant in as big a pot as you want to go? Maybe it's a big floor plant, and you don't want to keep increasing the pot size. So, but yet it's root bound, it's pot bound. So you slip the pot you slip the plant out of its pot, and then cut away the outer perimeter of roots. So with a sharp knife, just shave down all around. And what that will do is it removes that layer. And usually with a larger plant, I take off maybe 1 inch all around and just cut down through that, maybe tease away a few of the roots. Don't totally untangle the roots, because on an old established plant, that would really be quite dramatic and disturbing for that. But trim away that outer layer 1 inch or so all the way around, and then put it back into its pot. And that will give about 1 inch of fresh soil around, and maybe also remove the top inch of soil and roots also, because then that'll give 1 inch of fresh soil up on the top of that plant also. So there is a limit to the size of the plant pot that you really want to go. don't want to keep bouncing it up till it's a 3-foot diameter pot indoors.
We've been talking about,
unless you're in Kew Gardens or somewhere.
Right, if you've got that.
A conservatory.
But we've been talking about, moving plants into bigger pots. Do we ever want to move a plant into a smaller pot?
Yes. In fact, if it looks like a plant is ailing a little bit and it's in a fair-sized pot, and if a plant looks like it's maybe being overwatered a little bit, where it's just kind of looks like something isn't right, maybe take it out of that pot, take away the soil, look and see what's going on. If the roots haven't really filled that pot and that soil, maybe it's time to downsize, because the larger the pot, and if it's a small plant, it could be wallowing, like I said before, in too much soil and being overwatered. So downsizing the pot with less soil helps in that overwatering situation, so you're less likely to. So look at the roots good. If the roots look like they aren't filling that pot, maybe it is time to go to a smaller pot.
We were talking earlier, we kind of touched on this, but what are the benefits of terracotta pots versus a ceramic pot? Or, more of a glazed, finished ceramic pot.
Yeah, I like that air exchange, the oxygen exchange, and I like
in the terracotta.
In the terracotta.
They're breathable,
They're breathable.
Okay.
Yep, so I really like that. And, one of the biggest challenges, the biggest cause of houseplant death is overwatering. And overwatering means that we keep a plant continually too soggy. And if the terracotta natural clay pot, where they breathe, you're much less likely to be keeping that too soggy. So a natural terracotta clay pot can be a good remedy for the common malady of overwatering.
You can kind of pull away some of that moisture.
Exactly. Lets it wick out kind of through the sides of the pot.
What about, is there ever a point where you would want to have like a glazed ceramic? Like when you were talking about the African violet, would that be beneficial there? Because I'm assuming
they like it a little more moist. They don't like to kind of dry out quite as much as some plants. So then having a glazed pot or a plastic pot helps maintain that moisture a little bit. And same with the ferns also, that kind of are used to a little more moist condition.
We've talked about this before, but especially with houseplants, well, not especially, but you said you want to have a little bit of drainage in there, something like a perlite, and we've talked about you really don't want to do, we've heard this, putting rocks in the bottom or putting cans or something like that, putting things that take up volume, but that also may allow for drainage. And you said that doesn't really work, does it?
Exactly. The older method was to always put a layer of rocks or pebbles or broken clay pots down in the bottom of your houseplant pot, kind of over the drainage area. And I remember my mom used to do that. She used to pick up rocks out in the alley behind our house and put down in the bottom. But the soil scientists actually did research on this, and they found that when water traveled down through potting mix, when it hit that layer of rocks or gravel or other material, it would stay there and supersaturate the soil first, and then when the soil couldn't hold anymore, then it would pass down through. But when the water met that layer of change, it would make the upper part quite saturated before the excess would drain through. So how that affects houseplants is that it was making the soil stay a little too wet. And now, my mom was a great houseplant grower, so she didn't overwater her plants. So they grew fine, even though she put stuff down the bottom of the pot. But now, science has indicated to us we don't need to take that extra step. Just fill the pot from top to bottom with good high-quality potting mix. And so that's what I do. It doesn't pour out the bottom. The high-quality mixes kind of hold together, so you don't have dirt sifting out through the bottom of the drain hole. And so we can skip that step, and it actually is beneficial for plants. Now, this is for indoor house plants. Now, outdoor plants in containers, that's perfectly fine. If you've got a great big 4-foot tall planter outdoors, put milk jugs or something in the bottom so you don't have to spend a fortune on potting mix. But outdoor planters are different. We rarely have the problem of overwatering those. Usually it's the opposite. Yep. They dry out too quick, and because of the air, the wind, and everything else. But indoors, our houseplants, again, overwatering is a common problem, and overwatering can be complicated if you do put that layer of change, the rocks in the bottom of the pot. So it's easy. Just skip putting anything in. Just fill it top to bottom with potting mix.
I know some people like that idea of putting rocks in there because also it adds an anchor. It adds some bottom weight to keep something from tipping. Any suggestions on if you had a particular plant that maybe got tall enough that you were nervous about it tipping over if it was too light? Or is it just that by keeping it watered and keeping it the root ball in good shape, it won't tip over? Any concerns about things there? Anything that you would suggest to do with your plant to keep it from tipping then?
That's a good point. Jade trees are notorious for tipping like that. They don't need a real big pot. And of course, they become kind of tree-like and top-heavy. And so, I don't think a layer of rocks in the bottom is probably going to compensate enough for that. Usually, in those cases, a person needs to find a decorative outer type container that will help stabilize those plants. I should mention too, anybody that's listening that does have rocks in the bottom of their pots, don't panic. You've probably gotten onto it doesn't mean your plant's going to automatically die. You've probably gotten onto the right watering regimen for it. And again, my mom had rocks in the bottom of her pots and they did just fine. But, for repotting from future on out, you really don't need that extra step. And your plants might even thrive better because of it.
When you're looking to buy a new pot or a different container, or buy or pick up, use even one that you've got, what do you look for in a container? Any tips for choosing a container?
Boy, the main thing I look for is just that it has a good drainage hole in the bottom. And, one drain hole in the middle is enough. Some pots have other more drain holes kind of around the perimeter, such as many plastic pots have more drain holes. But that's really the main thing I look for, is just make sure that it's got a drain hole. And if a container that you really want to have a plant in and doesn't have a drainage hole, sometimes you can carefully drill one. Hopefully it doesn't crack. But otherwise, you have to be really careful with the watering on those.
Well, I remember we had this. I think it was a planter that we could have inside or outside. It was just a plastic pot, and we had it outside, but it had a reservoir kind of in the bottom, or that it would drain out, but it must have clogged up because it kept everything way too moist. So I think, just be careful with some of those things too, that, maybe don't go all in on that whole system right away. Find something that you think works.
I found out the same thing with some new outdoor containers that we bought this past year that had kind of that reservoir.
They were up a little bit higher, or
exactly. And I finally ended up drilling holes in the lower side and outpoured a whole bunch of water.
Yeah,
because they did seem to be. Maybe they need to perfect the patent on that a bit.
Well, let's take another break, and when we come back, more about repotting houseplants.
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
All right, we're back. We're talking about repotting your houseplants, something to do here in the middle of the winter, something to keep your green thumbs active and get your hands in the dirt. What are the steps in repotting? So we've talked about the material to put in the pot. We've talked about the pot itself. Now let's pull it out and let's pull out the pot.
Let's actually do this here.
Yeah.
So the first step is to moisten down the potting mix, and I like to do it the day before. Of the new mix.
Right.
Yeah, of the new mix. Yep. And you also bring up a good point. Maybe the day before, water the plant to. If the plant is dry, maybe water it the day before so that you're not dealing with a plant that's over dry. You don't want it soggy when you're transplanting it because it'll be like muddy.
Yeah.
But you don't want it bone dry either. So water it a day or two before so that the soil mix in the pot is mellow, not too wet, not too dry. Okay. But the potting mix that you've chosen, remember I mentioned that the potting mix, you could tell a good high quality potting mix because it's kind of light in the bag. That means it's got good light materials. But also when you open those bags, have you noticed how dry the material is?
Yeah.
And part of that is because it ships easier, less cost, less weight. But if you open the bag and try to use that dry mix fresh out of the bag, it's hard to use. It's kind of dusty, and also it's maybe a little more difficult to re-wet. So the day before, I like to open the bag of the potting mix, add water into the bag, mix it around, stir it around a little so it's kind of starting to feel like it's getting kind of mellow and nice and not so powdery dry, and then close the bag up. And the next day, that mix will have taken up a little bit of water. It'll just be nice and mellow and moist and much easier to use. Also, the roots of a plant don't want to come in contact with bone dry material because that could damage roots if that mix is too dry. So that's the first step. Moisten the mix down the day before, stir it around, and then the next day it's going to be nice and mellow, much easier to use. So then when you're actually ready to do the repotting, again, we've covered the table with some plastic or newspaper. Then to get the plant out of its pot, as I mentioned before, when you're going to check the roots of a pot, maybe turn the plant on its side, as long as it's a plant you can kind of handle. Turn the pot outside, I tap the bottom a little bit, and then with the other hand, kind of see if you can pull the plant out. If it gives resistance, then I run a butcher knife along the inner sides of the pot so the plant will pull out. And then if the plant is all root bound, so it's just totally a big mass of roots, instead of just setting that plant down in the pot with some fresh soil, again, we've bumped the pot up probably to 2 inches more in diameter. But I will usually, with a sharp knife, trim off a little of that outer layer of roots. Maybe it's only half an inch, but just so that there isn't that tight mass of roots on the outer root ball.
Yep.
Maybe just gently tease some of those outer roots apart. You don't need to totally untangle the whole works, but just so it's not a tight interface on the outside of that root ball. But just tease those apart a little bit, okay? Then add some potting mix down into the bottom of the pot. Set the plant and its root ball down in. And then with your potting mix, filter in around the side. There's probably going to be at least an inch of clear space that you're adding soil down in. And don't pack that down with your hands and fingers.
Okay.
We're not planting a tree outdoors.
Right.
And houseplant soil can easily become compacted in a pot. And so we don't want to press that down in there and compact it anymore. Watering is going to do that. Okay. Watering will be the packer of this. And so anyway, we'll fill up with potting mix. In a minute, I'm going to tell a secret that's very important about how deep to go in the pot.
Okay.
But so we're filling it up with potting soil and then tap that pot down a couple of times on the table. That will settle the soil a little bit. You might have to add a little more. But don't press down with your fingers and pack that thing. Otherwise, you're squishing out all the good airspace out of it. Okay, so fill it up. And then after you've got it to the proper depth, which is the secret I'll reveal in a minute, and then you'll water the plant thoroughly until some water's coming out the bottom drainage hole, and then discard that. So you want to hear about my big secret?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So after observing lots of houseplants and lots of photos that have been sent to me of ailing houseplants, I've noticed a common denominator in houseplants that are ailing.
What's that?
And here's the common denominator.
Okay.
The plants are the plants are sunk too low in the pot.
Oh.
Okay, so there's the rim of the pot, the upper rim of the pot, and then the plants are low down in, the top of the soil is maybe an inch or two down below the rim of the pot. Okay, the space between the top of the soil and the rim of the pot is called the head space. The head space. So I've noticed that plants that are where the top of the soil is way down in, so that it's kind of sunk down into the pot too far, I've noticed plants that are ailing. Okay, and here's why I believe they are often ailing. If the top of the soil is way down in the pot, so am I painting that picture okay?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's the top of the soil.
There's a ridge. There is
the top of the pot, and then there's quite a space, and then there's the soil.
Yeah.
Okay. There's less airflow across the top of that, so it doesn't dry out as good. You don't get as much air exchange. Also, sunk down like that with less airflow, there's more chance of rotting type organisms since the surface doesn't dry. That's also a good little protected spot for insects, fungus gnats, and other things to harbor and hide. And also, gravity does not pull the water down as efficiently. With houseplants, it's all about good drainage, so you're not overwatering, you want good drainage. Okay, if we think about it this way, okay, if you have a 30-story building and you're at the top of it, the pull of gravity is quite strong.
Yep.
Versus if I'm just 6 inches above ground and I step off, the pull of gravity isn't as great as if I'm up at the top of that 30-story building and going to step off. Okay, so what I'm getting at is in a pot where the soil is too low down, you're not using the full height of that soil. Okay. So in that pot, if you filled it higher with soil, gravity is going to have a greater pull, right? Just like the top of a 30-story building. Gravity will help pull down the water more efficiently. The drainage will be better and less chance of overwatering. If you're not using the maximum soil height in the pot, gravity isn't pulling the water down as much. You're going to have more drainage problems and greater chance of overwatering. And sometimes with houseplants, it's sometimes the finesse. It's sometimes these little things, seemingly little things that can have big impact. And I've noticed such a trend that if that headspace is too deep, that there's a trend that the plants can suffer on that. So how full should you fill the pot?
Right, because you don't want it overflowing with
exactly.
With
so if you fill the pot all the way up to the rim, well, when you go to water it, it's all going to flow off the side. You don't have a reservoir there. So the kind of the compromise, so you've got enough of a headspace to water it for a water reservoir, seems to be about 1/2 inch. So when you're repotting a houseplant, locate it in the pot so that the finished product, the potting mix, is just about 1/2 inch below the rim. That will give a reservoir for water, and yet you're maximizing that whole depth of soil. It'll have more root space, for one thing, and also the pull of gravity will be your friend, and it will be draining better. So that's I've never seen this written about or talked about, but I've noticed it so greatly, the importance of that proper headspace in a pot.
How much, and I know that this will depend on how big the pot is, but how much will new potting mix settle with a couple of waterings? Because it'll settle a little bit, like we were talking about. How much will it settle really noticeably, or are you fine with that 1/2 inch and water it and it'll settle fine?
That's why I tap the pot on the table a couple of times.
Right.
That'll help settle it a little bit.
Good call.
And then what I actually usually do, because you are right, John, in that when you water it, it'll oftentimes settle a little bit. So sometimes I will fill the new houseplant pot up to the rim with the potting mix, knowing that when I water it, and you have to water it slowly at first because there isn't much of a reservoir there, but it will settle. So sometimes it will settle to that right amount. But if you begin filling it up to leaving that 1/2 inch of headspace, and if you do find that it's settled a little bit, well, then add a little more soil to bring it up to about that 1/2 inch of headspace. Now, what if you've currently got a plant and you're listening and you're a little bit concerned because it's like 3 inches down, the top of the soil, 3 inches down below the rim? It's dangerous to just add a soil over the top, because that might make the kind of the crown of the plant, where leaves meet roots, that might make it just too low. So it's better to lift the plant out of the pot, add the soil into the bottom of the pot, and then put the plant down in. And so we can't always just add a large amount of soil to the top of that. So anyway, maybe it seems like I'm rambling on and on about headspace, but I've just noticed this so frequently that when I get a picture of ailing houseplants, I've just come to notice that the headspace is oftentimes really, really deep.
After you repot the plant, the first couple waterings, because again, we're talking about that you don't want to pack the sides with new soil around the sides. You want to but do you want to make sure that you really water around the perimeter of that pot to make sure that the sides are getting?
Boy, you got it. Yeah, to make sure that there are no air spaces down in there. And because roots can't bridge airspace, so it's very important to get that water kind of thoroughly, because that's just, and the same is true when you plant a tree outside. You've really got to water it well those first times, because then that will settle and eliminate the air pockets through which roots just can't penetrate.
We've been talking about these pots, and I think visually what I've had in mind is a pot that you pick up with 2 hands and maybe put it up on top of a table, and maybe the plant's a foot or 2, something like that tall. What do you do with like big tall plants, floor plants, that you've got in a big container on the floor? You're going to break your back if you lift that up and put it on the table, and you may not have ceiling space for it.
And you might break the plant also.
Right, you may break the plant, and it's also tough to tip it over on its side. How do you repot a bigger plant?
Well, what comes to mind right now is, remember I mentioned Kew Gardens in England? Okay, well, the world's oldest houseplant is 400 some years old. It's been in the conservatory at Kew Gardens for 400 years, and it was repotted, I believe, a year ago. And there were 12 men, all with yellow hard hats on, repotting this thing. And so they definitely didn't tip it over on the table and pull the pot off. And so what a person can do is similar to what they did. Boy, can you imagine the pressure of repotting a plant that's the oldest house plant in the world?
That's a lot. That probably took a lot more preparation than what we're talking about.
We're doing, more than newspaper on the table. Yeah. And but anyway, so what a person can do with a very large plant that you just can't motivate around is don't try to take it totally out of the pot. If the pot is currently a fine size, but it just needs fresh soil, then scoop soil out of the inner perimeter, maybe the outer inches or so, and take some off the top, dispose of that soil, and add new. So a very large floor-type plant doesn't need total taken out of its pot, unless you got to go to a bigger pot. I think at Kew Gardens, it was going back in the same size pot, but just needed some fresh soil. So if you're comfortable with size pot, just get some soil off the top, some on the outer perimeter, add for the fresh soil, and I think it'll be good to go.
What about care after repotting? So once we've got it all repotted,
we mentioned the good thorough watering. Make sure you dispose of the excess that drains out of those thorough waterings. And then move the plant back to the location that you had it. If it is a sun-loving plant that you've had in the sun, maybe give it a break for a couple of days in a non-sunny location, just so that it give it a chance to kind of accustom a little bit, adjust to the new pot before you give it. But in most cases, you can probably return it to its original location. And after that good thorough watering, it probably isn't going to need watering for a little, so make sure we don't overwater it right away too.
All right. Don, this has been great. This is a lot of fun, and it gives people a lot of good tips on if they need to be repotting their house plants.
No, I need to put my money where my mouth is. I've got some plants that have been in pots longer than 2 years, so I'm motivated now. I need to do some repotting also.
All right. Well, if people have more questions about repotted plants, or if they just want to send you pictures or talk about their experiences in repotting, what's the best way to reach you?
Send me an email, donald.kinsler, KINZLER, @ndsu.edu. And I'd especially like to hear from anyone that might have a heritage type plant, maybe an old jade plant, a Christmas cactus, and let me know how often you've repotted it or how it's doing in those pots. It's always fun to hear of these stories.
And also, if people have suggestions for what they'd like to hear us talk about on the show, that would be great.
Great idea. We're open to suggestions. It's always great to hear from everyone.
Well, Don, it's good to see you again after a holiday break, and I'm looking forward to 2025 together and growing together.
Thank you, John, and thanks everyone for listening.